Tony, welcome to Face.
Thank
Nice,
you.
nice.
Great to be
Yeah,
here.
yeah, nice to have you here. So, what I usually do with first guests is uh, have them go back in time and talk a little bit about their journey. So, let's say you're in high school or college, and
Ooh.
what were you thinking back then? Did you think you'd be involved in the financial markets? What were you planning to do?
I didn't actually. It's interesting you asked that. I just wanted to live all around the world. That's really what drove me in my late teens and early 20s. And straight out of undergrad, I got a job with a freight forwarder, which is one of the least glamorous careers you can get. But it got me in international markets and international trade immediately. And I was talking with people in other markets, looking at trade, processing shipments, walking warehouses, all that stuff. Again, very unglamorous. But it really got me into the nuts and bolts of trade and currencies and markets very, very quickly, understanding the impact of a Forex market change on,
Yeah.
say, trade with Taiwan or Japan or something, was very material to me. It wasn't theoretical at all. I ended up living in Europe for a few years. I lived in Asia for 15 years. I led global research for the Economist Intelligence Unit. I led Asia consulting for a firm called IHS, which is now part of S&P. And then 10 years ago, we started Complete Intelligence, which is an AI-driven platform for forecasting global markets and economics. And 6 months ago, I started a platform called Cloak and Dagger, which focuses on geopolitics, did that with Albert Marco, and we continue to do that today. And we just have a new piece up on Europe this morning.
Okay, so yeah, it's a great story and interesting how travel was the driving force to lead you into, seeing that people had to shift currencies on a lot of transactions, and you probably saw the big spreads that banks were charging your company,
Huge.
and yeah, and knew that there was probably a better way. So, great to have you. I mean, it is the topic of the day, so let me ask you this: with what happened in Europe and the extreme right um, gaining more seats than people thought they were going to, it was a surprise. Although historically, Tony, does this remind you of another time and era where the right started gaining power, like the 1920s and 30s?
Yeah, you know what? I don't know. I hear a lot of those analogies, but when I see the results of the election, when I saw them last night and I see them this morning, you know, the results, they're only EU Parliament results. They're not national level results, first of all.
Okay, all right,
Second, whenever there's a move to the right in Europe, I think the go-to for many people is, oh no, here we go. There's going to be brown shirts in the street, and
yeah,
the same
right,
old story is going to happen again. You know, I think it's different. It's hard. You have the institutions in Europe that make that pretty hard. And if you look, for example, at Macron's immediate kind of jump into elections, into new parliamentary elections in France,
yeah,
I don't think Macron is the least bit worried about Le Pen taking over the legislature in France. I think he knows that right wing wins EU Parliament, media jumps in and says brown shirts are going to be in the street tomorrow. Europeans don't really want that. And so when they vote in France, there's more of ultimately a more centrist vote because people dial back their expectations. So I think it's possible that we see that, but I'm not quite sure that that's really where we're going. I guess the other dimension of that is kind of, oh no, we're going to be the next Hungary, right? With Viktor Orban and all this other stuff.
right.
It's possible, but von der Leyen is not going anywhere. The ECB's policy is not going anywhere. So we've seen this decline in the euro by 50 basis points or something this morning. And, I don't, I think that's kind of a short-term issue. Because when people really kind of wake up and look around and see, that the mechanisms of the infrastructure and of the bureaucracy are still in place, and these guys will have really limited ability to change major policies in Europe. Are they going to change the inflationary policies in Europe? Probably not. Are they going to change immigration? Maybe at the edges. And are they going to change the war in Ukraine? Probably not. So those are kind of the three top voting issues among those voters over the weekend. And they'll have, I think, a negligible impact on overall policy for the EU.
Okay, let me ask you about Ukraine. So, do most of these newly elected from the right support Ukraine? Because Ukraine used to have, they fought with Germany. So I'm
Yeah, yeah, they do.
wondering, I mean, they wore German uniforms. They were part of the force against Russia, right? So,
Right.
kind of a historical enemy. So are these politicians going to stiffen the back of Europe to step up to do whatever has to be done so that Putin doesn't win? Would you say that's a positive for Ukraine this election?
I would say neutral to slightly negative. I mean, these guys are very
Isolationists?
nationalistic. Sorry?
Oh, so they'd be more isolationist than wanting to support Ukraine.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think
Okay,
they're looking at things like energy costs,
all right.
and how they hurt, especially in 2022 on energy costs. They're looking at providing for, their people, their nation. That's first and foremost. So I think the Ukraine calculation for many of them, of course, it's not all of them, but for many of them, I think it's secondary. That's not to say they don't support Ukraine. That's not to say they hope Ukraine falls to Russia. But I think that's a secondary calculation for a lot of these right-leaning or far-right people who were just elected in Europe.
Do you think that this could be a foreshadowing of how national elections go to some extent?
I
Is this
think
like a market tell for future elections?
Well, to some extent, yes. But if we just make the comparison to the US, you see immigration as a big issue in the US. And last week you saw Biden come out
Yeah.
with immigration and executive order on immigration. And so, the national leaders in Europe, similar to the way Biden came out with immigration EO, um, they will make incremental moves toward the center compared to where they've been over the past couple of years. And that's just in response to this election. So if the elections were held today, would it impact national elections? Yeah, it probably would. But since the national elections are going to be held in some time, the politicians will at least kind of signal some moderation, some movement toward the center, and then it'll have I believe a relatively small impact on national politics rather than EU politics.
Do you have an overall dollar view, Tony? Last week after the NFP, the dollar roared
Mhm.
and has taken out all the shorts above these highs here.
Right.
Do you think that first of all, do you have a view? Are you bullish a dollar? You're bearish a dollar? Where do you come down?
Yeah, let me share, if you don't mind, I'll share some
Oh yeah.
forecasts with you. Okay, how about
Okay.
that?
Go ahead.
Okay, so now we really look at um, we look at monthly interval forecasts. Okay, we're not looking at intraday or daily. We keep that stuff behind the curtain, but for our subscribers, it's really a monthly interval forecast. And a big part of what we do is we show our forecast accuracy and error rates, so that our subscribers understand how we've performed. So we're not doing some black box voodoo where you have to guess, and calculate on your own how we perform. So we do see the dollar weakening slightly over the next few months. And there are a number of reasons for that. But when we look at, I just want to show you kind of our accuracy, our 1 month and 3 month forward error. Our accuracy on dollar forecasts is pretty high. Okay. So we have a high base low. If you look at the bottom of this forecast, we have a high base low for those forecasts as well. But this really is on Fed policy. It's on relative strength of the dollar compared to, say the euro and other things. So we're not necessarily looking at the euro weakening dramatically as we've seen in trading this morning. Okay. So when we move over to, do you have any questions on the dollar on why and what our outlook is?
Uh, no, just go ahead. I'm just following what you're saying. So,
Sure.
if I
Okay.
have a question, I'm not bashful.
Great. Okay.
All right.
For the euro, again, we've seen the euro fall pretty dramatically, and that y-axis there is only goes to the hundreds. If you look at the bottom, this shows much more detailed forecast here. But we do see the euro appreciating a bit over the coming months. And so that's kind of the other side of our dollar forecast. Now, the dollar weakness is really, that's the DX. So that's really in relation to the euro. And the
Right.
euro's got a trade surplus. There are other things that are really helping the euro. There's presumption that ECB will continue to be very, very dovish. Will that continue? We're not so sure about that. Now, when we look at Asian currencies,
Yeah.
we
How
look
about the yen, U.S. dollar yen?
right. So when we look at the yen, um, so when we look at the yen, we see the yen continuing to weaken versus the dollar. Okay, and we've had this
Yeah.
view for some time. So we think the yen will hit its weakest point in kind of Jan-Feb of 25. So it's going to continue to grind weaker. It's going to be managed weaker over the
Manage.
next 6 to 9 months versus the dollar. And that's a Japan domestic issue. You just saw, Q1 GDP was revised down, was negative. It wasn't as weak as people thought, but it's still contracting. Consumer sentiment and spend is down. Things don't look great in Japan. Meanwhile, you've got the Ministry of Finance and BOJ trying to talk the yen up, but nobody's really convinced. Now, this is on a relative basis. This is good for trade, and it pushes the CNY weaker as well, because those Chinese exporters have to compete with Japan and Korea, because China isn't as cheap as it once was. So when we look at CNY, we do see CNY gradually getting weaker as well over the
Yep.
next several months. And so again, that's a managed weakness, but it's managed partly because we see CNY declining, or sorry, JPY declining. And so, these are all, the dollar is becoming relatively stronger compared to Asia, but relatively weaker compared to Europe. Sorry, let
Okay.
me show you some of
All
the
right.
accuracy on those as well. So,
Do you have any
so
expectations out of the BOJ this week, Tony?
Um, well, do we ever really have expectations on the BOJ? I mean,
Yeah.
it's kind of status quo as it always is. It's a lot of talking. Ueda is not an aggressive BOJ chair. He doesn't have the heft that Abe had, and he's a little bit afraid to change things too much. So I think, in terms of, say, weakening Asian currencies, he's probably the right guy there, because he's not really standing in the way of a weakening JPY compared to US dollar. And given where Japan is economically with falling GDP and consumer sentiment, they really do need a weaker yen to help stimulate things.
Okay. If we can move on to risk, okay, and if you're, and I believe you do cover, how can you not cover things like S&Ps and Qs and NVIDIA?
Sure.
NVIDIA splitting, any dynamic with NVIDIA splitting that gives you an insight for risk on continuing, or are you starting to tell your subscribers to be cautious about risk? Where do you stand?
Well, I think what we're seeing there, so let me pull up the S&P. So, we're really seeing, at least until the election, a fairly sideways trade in the S&P. There's not a lot to, aside from say the top 3, 4 stock movers, regardless of what Apple says today about their AI or whatever, we're not seeing a huge impetus for massive growth in the S&P. After the election, we see things, at least at this point, with 7, 8 months of visibility, we really think that we'll see more of a growth driver post-election. But at this point, we're not really seeing it. And I think that cuts both ways. If Biden is reelected, that gives Yellen much more latitude to spend even more than she's been spending on the fiscal side. If Trump is elected, he'll push very hard for lower interest rates. And so either way, it seems like we'll see at least some upward movement in markets going into, say, December, Jan of 25.
Okay. So people that are worried about the election should put that aside.
Yeah,
Because go ahead.
if you remember when Trump was elected in 2016, we saw markets risk off for about 2 hours after the election. And
Limit
then,
down.
right. And then we saw markets rally pretty hard shortly after that, right? So,
Yeah.
is Trump good for markets? I don't know.
Yeah.
Is Biden good or bad for markets? Well, we've seen over the last 4 years things have done pretty well, but they've had some serious fiscal and monetary tailwinds behind them. So the question really is, how long can we continue to do that? I think it'll last as long as it can.
Okay. View on yields and the Fed coming up this week, big week, and CPI, some red events. Do you normally stand aside on red days, Tony, or hold positions through these numbers?
It really depends. That really depends on the market, the segment, the sector, the stock. So, and it really depends on individual thesis. So I don't, sometimes yes, sometimes no. So I know that's a really ambiguous response. But we're looking at what the overall trend is on the, say, more medium-term horizon as to whether or not we kind of hold, and it all depends on kind of where those stops are as well.
Well, you need a lot of whiteout if you keep a dot plot chart,
Oh yeah,
right? I mean,
right.
the movements and re-rating of markets over the past 3 months has been amazing, from looking for 6 to maybe a hike to then at least 2 to maybe 1. Uh, the market's confused, Tony. Do you think Powell is confused too?
I don't think Powell is confused. I think we have a battle of the regional Fed heads trying to advocate for their position. And we get somebody like Goolsby, who is kind of a stand-up comedian, come up, and it's really hard to take him seriously. And then you get some other people come up who are a little more thoughtful about things. And you want to take them seriously, but then you see the votes in the minutes, and there's really not a lot of differing opinion when it comes to the votes. So the chatter in between meetings is, I think, more meant to rein in Powell's comments. Powell tends to either calibrate way too dovish or way too hawkish when he's in front of media. So he'll talk, markets will react a certain way. The regional heads will come out in the
Yeah.
weeks that follow to calibrate the message that Powell has said. I think Powell himself has clarity on where he wants things to go, but he's just not great at messaging sometimes. So those guys have to come out to try to calibrate that message to say what he meant to say.
Okay. So some of the stars of the last quarter have been miners. Precious metals have been on a tear. We're in a little bit of a pullback phase. Do you think that the move in precious metals has legs and nothing goes straight up, but do you think that there's more left in the precious metal move in gold? We could see
Yeah,
new highs.
let me pull up gold here. And it looks like it's a really boring chart. It looks like we're expecting gold to continue to move up, but at a much slower pace. And let me check silver here. Okay, so we do see silver. I'll share this one. We do see silver coming down in the coming months, but again, it's not a dramatic fall. But we do see silver coming off a bit in the coming months and then kind of heading sideways. So until we have some clarity on where monetary policy is heading and what's happening in the economy, I think Q2 GDP and the makeup of Q2 GDP is going to tell us a lot about where, say, metals are heading, where the dollar's heading, and so on. So a lot of things, the S&P, gold, Fed, these sorts of things, I think are really in a holding pattern until we get some clarity on where those markets are going.
Okay, the biggest lesson you learned in the trading business, Tony.
Ooh, it's okay to be wrong. Just get out as quickly as you can, right? I
Okay.
mean, when we do our forecast, the reason we post our error is so that people know this isn't my opinion or this isn't our team's opinion. This is a data-driven opinion, and we owe it to our subscribers to tell them where we've been wrong. And so we want them to understand that this is a data-driven hypothesis, and it's really not. This isn't really a recommendation. This is simply a calculated kind of outlook. So, but there are months when we're wrong, more than say 5% off in certain cases, and there are months when we're in areas where we're really good. And so I think humility is the name of the game, and just understanding when to cut and when to find something else has been a hard lesson to learn at times.
Yeah, and if you hear yourself saying, well, I think I'll watch this a while, it's time to liquidate and shut down your platform,
Sure. Yep,
right? I think I'll
that's right.
just watch it. Or how about this, Tony? You ever hear yourself think this? I hope this one works.
Oh, sadly.
Anyway, bro, it was I really want to thank you for stepping up last
Thank you,
minute.
Dale.
And I'm gonna, if you're interested, keep you in the cycle and rotation, and
Love to.
bring you back. And what's the best way for people to follow your work at Complete Intelligence or get a hold of you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So on Twitter, I'm at Tony Nash Nerd. We have a weekly
Why nerd,
YouTube.
Tony? Why do you think you're a nerd?
Dale, I've been a nerd my whole life, and I might
Uh,
as well own
you
up to
think
it.
girls like that? You think girls like nerds?
No,
That's
no,
why you
no.
took it.
I've been
All
married
right.
for 26 years.
All right. Okay. All right.
She's known I'm a nerd from the start. We have a
All
weekly
right.
YouTube show called The Week Ahead, and
Okay.
CompleteIntel.com is our website. Thanks, Dale. Thank you.
All right. All right. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you.
You're now my trading warrior brother. You got through an interview with me,
Yep.
so appreciate it. I'll be in touch with you.
Thank
Check
you.
Tony out. You know, humble guy, doing his best to keep people on the right side of things, and it's data driven, not discretionary. So that's a wrap for us, everyone. Remember, don't just count your data driven trades, count your blessings, and See you tomorrow for Turnaround Tuesday. Join the team in 16 minutes on the Morning Edge. Adios, and thanks once again, Tony Nash.
Hey traders, this is Blake Morrow with ForexAnalytix. Thanks for stopping by our YouTube channel. Don't forget to like these videos, share them, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of the content that we provide here for free. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you in the next video.